Good morning, everyone. After successful celebration of World Hospice and Palliative Care Day all around country, like a Diwali celebration for palliative care physicians and palliative care community, we are again back to the classes. So today in our class, Dr. Neetu will speak. Dr. Neetu has just finished her MD, and the topic which she will cover is gastrointestinal emergencies. Dr. Neetu is a very bright senior resident of our department. She has finished MD, not only finished MD, but she has participated in various conferences, presented many posters, and all our seminars which she used to present used to be of high quality. And hopefully today's lecture, she will try to emphasize and she will try to give you a brief that how should be the approach of a palliative care physician when a patient presents with gastrointestinal emergencies. So Neetu, please go ahead and start your lecture. And Arun will take the questions at the end. So please write down your questions because there will be many queries, questions. So please write down in the chat box and we will take up these questions at the end.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I thank Dr. Sushma and all the IAPC team for having given me this wonderful opportunity to present in such a big platform. Thank you. So right away, we will start with gastrointestinal emergencies. So in the outline, we are going to see upper gastrointestinal bleed, lower gastrointestinal bleed, chemotherapy-induced gastrointestinal mucositis, and perforation peritonitis. So let's go straight away into gastrointestinal bleed. Coming to the introduction part, this can range from mild and asymptomatic to massive life-threatening hemorrhage. The anatomic division of the duodenum and jejunum by the Treats ligament division separates the upper and lower GI tract, thereby classifying the bleeding as upper or lower. So here we can see the ligament of Treats. This part is a duodenum, this part is a jejunum. So both are being separated by this ligament of Treats, also known as a suspensory ligament of the duodenum. So any bleeding which comes above the ligament of Treats is classified as an upper GI bleeding. Anything that comes below the Treats ligament is considered as lower GI bleeding. To make this more clear, we can again see this diagram. Same thing. This is a duodenum. This is a jejunum. This is a ligament of Treats. So upper GI hemorrhage is bleeding proximal to ligament of Treats, and same with lower GI hemorrhage, which is bleeding distal to ligament of Treats. So once again, GI bleeding is characterized as upper GI when bleeding is from the esophagus, stomach, or duodenum, and it is classified as lower GI bleed when the bleeding is from jejunum, ileum, or colon. And GI hemorrhage from the UGI tract occurs proximal to the ligament of Treats, and it is more in incidence. Out of all the GI hemorrhages, around 70 to 80% are from UGI, and LGI tract bleeding occurs distal to the ligament of Treats, as explained. And coming to incidence, out of all GI hemorrhages, this occupies almost 20 to 30%. So coming to the bleeding presentation, clinical presentation of GI bleeding includes two types. That is, one is occult GI bleeding, other is overt GI bleeding. Occult means bleeding in quantities which are too small to be macroscopically observable. Coming to overt GI bleeding, this is macroscopically observable bleeding with accompanying clinical symptoms also. Clinical symptoms can be anemia or tachycardia. So overt GI bleeding can include hematemesis, melena, or hematochezia. Hematemesis is vomiting of red or coffee brown appearance. Melena is a passage of black tarry stools, and hematochezia is a passage of fresh blood perennis in stools. Coming to common upper gastrointestinal bleeding disorders, acute upper gastrointestinal bleeding is from the esophagus, stomach, or duodenum, as already explained. And common causes of acute upper GI bleeding include Number one is peptic ulcer. This is the most common cause of UGI bleeding. This is associated with acute bleeding due to anatomic position to major arteries. This erosive disorder is associated with H. pylori infection, stress, aspirin intake, and other NSAIDs. Number two, esophageal varices. This is associated with portal hypertension due to liver disease. The causative factors of liver disease include excessive alcohol and hepatitis. Number three, malignancy. The most common malignancies which are involved are adenocarcinoma of the stomach and gastric lymphoma. And bleeding occurs with ulceration of the mucosal surface in these cases. Number four, Mallory stairs. So profuse vomiting causes mucosal lesions followed by hematemesis. Coming to the common lower GI bleeding disorders, acute lower GI bleeding is from jejunum, ileum, or colon, resulting in hemodynamic instability, anemia, and the possible need for blood transfusions. The causes are, number one, diverticular disease. Bleeding is common in acute colonic diverticula, and most bleeds here stop spontaneously. And after two major bleeds, operative intervention should be considered. Number two, inflammatory bowel disease. Here, bloody diarrhea is common, and urgent surgery is usually recommended, especially in ulcerative colitis, which presents as bloody diarrhea, and ischemic colitis, which presents as bloody diarrhea accompanied by pain. Number three, colonic tumors. Minor fresh bleeding and occult blood loss is common. The presentation of profuse bleeding may occur as well in colonic tumors. Number four, angiodysplasias. Vascular anomalies present as multiple lesions in the ascending colon and cecum. Bleeding is commonly slow but intermittent. Benign anorectal disease is the next one. So anorectal lesions such as hemorrhoids can present as hemorrhage. Number six, there can also be iatrogenic hemorrhages like occurring after a polypectomy. So we go to the enhanced focus on common acute GI bleeding disorders. So here let's see a case. This is case number one, Mrs. X. So Mrs. X is a 28-year-old healthy woman. Over the past week, she complained of weakness and loss of appetite. On last evening, she suddenly experienced diarrhea with recurrent episodes of black semi-liquid stools. After 3 hours, she complained of severe weakness, dizziness, and had a feeling as she was passing out. Her mother took her to ED. Her medication history revealed she had severe low backache and was prescribed tab aceclofenac TDS. She stated she had taken this high prescription dose for 6 months. She was not drinking even half a glass of fluid with a dose due to loss of appetite also. Her hematocrit was 25 and hemoglobin was 9. So we all know this one is a typical case history of peptic ulcer disorder. So gastroduodenal ulcers are common cause of upper GI bleeding. So defects in the gastric or duodenal mucosa can extend deep into the wall, and the mucosa becomes vulnerable for breakdown, and this can result in bleeding. What are the risk factors of peptic ulcer disorder? Number one, H. pylori infection. So H. pylori infects the superficial gastric mucosa, and this will disrupt the mucosal layer. And this makes the mucosa more susceptible to acid damage. And also there will be chronic inflammation due to H. pylori. This can lead to gastritis. And altered gastric secretion and tissue damage can also occur, which can lead to peptic ulcer disease. Number two risk factor is NSAIDs. This includes low-dose aspirin also, which can predispose to ulceration. And recurrent ulcers can be there, and complications related to it can be there. Number three, physiological stress associated with life events as well as psychological factors. Number four, excess gastric acid. So impairment of mucosal integrity leading to cell membrane permeability will be there, which can result in intramural acidosis, cell death, and ulceration. So all these predisposes to peptic ulcer disorder. So these are the risk factors. Here we can see the relative risk for upper GI bleeding for individual NSAIDs. So we can see here that as the COX-2 selectivity increases, the risk of GI toxicity decreases. As in the most safest gastric profile is for the COX selective NSAIDs like rofecoxib, meloxicam, celecoxib, then diclofenac, ibuprofen, like that. So here we can see the Forest classification of peptic ulcers bleeding. So stage 1 is there, stage 2 is there, and stage 3 is there. So we can start from stage 3. In stage 3, there is no bleeding as such. The ulcer base is clean. So we can see a clean base ulcer here in stage 3. Coming to stage 2, so we can see stage 2 is divided into stage 2A, 2B, and 2C. So in stage 2C, we can see only there is a flat spot in the ulcer crater. There's a spot. Coming to stage 2B, we can see adherent clots. In stage 2A, we can see that there is non-bleeding, but the vessel is visible here. And in stage 1, we have again stage 1A and 1B. We can see in 1B that the bleed is oozing. So from here, the visible vessel has started oozing. And in stage 1A, which is the most dangerous, the vessel has started spurting. So this is known as spurting bleed. So definitely stage 1 and stage 2 are dangerous, and stage 3 does not have a bleed. So here we can see the rebleeding risk. The risk is maximum for stage 1A, which is up to 100%, and 1B also, this is also 50%. And stage 3, as we can see, we have a less risk for rebleed, that is only 3 to 5%. Coming to major clinical manifestations of peptic ulcer disorder, we can see dyspepsia. Sometimes ulcers can be silent, and even there can be ulcer complications like penetration, fistulation, perforation. There can be gastroesophageal reflux. Coming to the diagnosis and testing, the cause and bleeding site must be identified to stop bleeding and empower hemodynamic stability. Upper endoscopy, this is a standard for diagnosing peptic ulcer disease. This is 90% accurate in detecting gastroduodenal lesions. And while endoscopy is benign ulcers, they are like flat, smooth ulcers with smooth, rounded edges. Coming to imaging, mostly barium radiography. This is not commonly used because of the radiation to patients and the inability to biopsy lesion by barium radiography. And in other imagings, we can see ulcer as round surrounded by edema. Coming to the test for H. pylori, patients diagnosed with peptic ulcer should be tested for H. pylori infection with a biopsy with upper endoscopy. Non-invasive tests are also there, like urea breath test or stool H. pylori antigen test. The patient is positive, then eradication of the infection should be done. Coming to the treatment of bleeding ulcers, so initial assessment consists of we have to observe the clinical presentation and lab findings. The evaluation of hemodynamic stability is at most important. Determining the need for blood transfusion or fluid resuscitation, depending on the condition of the patient. Hemoglobin and hematocrit levels are used to assess GI bleeding. But during the initial 4 to 6 hours, these lab values will be normal in range due to time needed for the body to shift fluids to the intravascular compartment. So this is also very important that acid suppression with treatment by a PPI is recommended for all bleeding ulcer patients. The PPI stabilizes blood clots by elevating the gastric pH levels. And pantoprazole and esomeprazole are examples of common IV formulations given twice a day with tapering to daily administration. And when there is no evidence of bleeding, the patient is switched to oral PPI such as omeprazole. So again, we can see this article, what is given in British Medical Journal regarding management of upper GI bleeding. So pre-endoscopic management. Before endoscopy, what all we have to see? Hemodynamic assessment and resuscitation as needed. Then blood transfusion at a hemoglobin threshold of 7 to 8 gram per deciliter. Higher threshold if severe bleeding, which also occurs with hypotension. So for risk assessment, there's a particular scoring system that is known as the Glasgow-Blatchford score, that is GBS, that I'll come a little detail later. So if the score is less than 1, then we can consider outpatient endoscopy and management. Like better when scores are less. So if score is less than 1, the patient can be managed in OPD basis also. Endoscopy can be done there and we can manage. And erythromycin as a prokinetic agent and PPI may be considered even before endoscopy. And patients with cirrhosis should receive vasoactive drugs as well as antibiotics. This one is a Glasgow-Blatchford score. As we've already mentioned, the components are blood urea, hemoglobin, systolic blood pressure, other markers like beats per minute, melena, syncope, liver disease, and heart failure. This is a detailed scoring system. If the score is less than 1, then it is safe and patient can be considered for management on OPD basis. And so other things which are given in that particular BMJ article, the use of pre-endoscopic IV PPI has been assessed in several studies. A meta-analysis of 6 RCTs comprising 2,223 patients found that the use of these drugs before endoscopy is associated with reduced risk of stigmata of bleeding as well as need for endoscopic therapy, which means we can use PPIs. And considering tranexamic acid, meta-analysis has reported reduced mortality with tranexamic acid in patients with UGI bleeding, but many studies were of poor quality and had been undertaken before the widespread use of PPIs. So the use is equivocal. And regarding somatostatin analogs, PPI should not be given concurrently to patients who are receiving somatostatin or analogs because this provides inhibition of gastric acid secretion comparable to that provided by PPIs, which means both have similar mechanism of action. Recommended doses are terlipressin 2 mg every 4 hours and somatostatin 250 micrograms bolus followed by 250 to 500 micrograms per hour. And also octreotide and vapreotide can also be used 50 micrograms bolus followed by 50 micrograms per hour. And regarding antibiotics, meta-analysis showed that antibiotics reduce infection certainly, as well as rebleeding and mortality. So in patients with cirrhosis and upper intestinal bleeding, you should definitely go for a course of antibiotic. Coming to the endoscopic management. So endoscopy is recommended within 24 hours in patients admitted to hospital. If the patient has severe bleeding with hemodynamic instability, then urgent endoscopy should be performed. That if the patient is not hemodynamically stable, then urgent endoscopy. Otherwise, we can wait for 24 hours. So ulcers with active bleeding and non-bleeding visible vessels should receive endoscopic therapy. And endoscopic therapy should also be used for ulcers with adherent clothes. If you have listened carefully, you would have understood that this belongs to stage 1 and 2, the Forest classification. And several types of endoscopic therapy are available depending on the classification of the bleeding ulcer. So endoscopy can be used for thermal coagulation, which is performed to stop bleeding and seal the vessel to prevent the recurrent bleeding. Also, hemoclips can be used. This is similar to surgical ligation. Then fibrin sealants can be used. Also, injection therapy with diluted epinephrine injection can be used. This can create a vasospasm and local tamponade. Here we can visualize. Now, this is a post-endoscopic management. Again, patients of ulcers with high-risk lesions like active bleeding, visible vessel, or adherent clots, that is stage 1 and 2, should receive high-dose PPI inhibitors for at least 72 hours post-endoscopy. And patients with cirrhosis should continue antibiotics for up to 7 days, regardless of the bleeding source. And when used for secondary prevention, aspirin should be continued or reintroduced soon after hemostasis is achieved. That is, and early reintroduction of other antithrombotic drugs is also recommended after hemostasis is achieved to reduce the thrombotic events and death. That is, while used for secondary prevention only, aspirin can be continued. Or soon after hemostasis, it should be reintroduced. And also other antithrombotic drugs should be reintroduced early itself after hemostasis achieved. So these are the recommendations from major published guidelines on non-varicose upper GI bleeding. Here we can see guidelines from American College of Gastroenterology, American Society for Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, and European Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy. Also nice guidelines. So they have commented on risk scoring, prokinetics, pre-endoscopy PPIs, timing of endoscopy, and post-endoscopy PPIs. So for risk scoring, majority of the guidelines have shown that prognostic scales are recommended to identify high and low risk groups. So identification of high and low risk groups are much important. Regarding prokinetics, some guidelines have told that promotility agents should not be used routinely. Some have told that we have to consider promotility agents like IV erythromycin. And regarding pre-endoscopy PPIs, majority of the guidelines are telling that IV PPIs should be considered pre-endoscopically, but should not delay endoscopic time. And coming to the timing of endoscopy, again, most of the guidelines have told endoscopy should be undertaken within 24 hours for most patients. And if the patient is highly hemodynamically unstable, then patient should be immediately taken for endoscopy and further management. Coming to post-endoscopy PPIs, majority have told to give IV PPI bolus followed by infusion after successful endoscopy therapy, at least for 72 hours. So if endoscopy fails or interventional angiography fails, if both these fails, then we can go for surgery. The specific indications are peptic ulcer hemorrhage, hemodynamic instability after 3 blood transfusion units, if the patient is in shock, or if there is perforation. Examples of surgery include oversewing of ulcer, truncal vagotomy, pyloroplasty, and selective vagotomy. So coming to our Mrs. X, how we have managed. Imaging had revealed a 5 centimeter peptic ulcer And she was hospitalized to provide fluid resuscitation and administer IV PPI. The next morning, she was stabilized and discharged from the hospital with a prescription for Pantop tablet and iron. And she was instructed to stop the prescription aceclofenac, avoid spicy foods, and return to the emergency room. Bleeding reoccurred. An appointment was scheduled the next day with a gastroenterologist for endoscopy and treatment of peptic ulcer secondary to NSAID. So that's done with peptic ulcer. So we'll move on to case 2, Mr. J. So Mr. J is a 68-year-old man with a history of active alcoholism, cirrhosis, and ascites. He was brought to the emergency room via ambulance. He complained of hematemesis and hematochezia for 4 days, lightheadedness, weakness, and heart racing. His hematocrit was 24, hemoglobin 5.8, blood pressure 86/49, and heart rate 150. So from this case, we can understand that 68-year-old man, history of active alcoholism, cirrhosis, and ascites, and currently he's in trouble. We can see that he's not hemodynamically much stable. Okay, so he is diagnosed of acute variceal hemorrhage. So let's go to acute variceal hemorrhage. So UGI bleeding from varices is caused by portal hypertension associated with advanced liver disease. Varices can be in the esophagus, stomach, or small bowel. Gastrointestinal bleeding is due to rupture of portosystemic collaterals or as a complication of cirrhosis. Rupture leads with high mortality due to difficulty with controlling the bleeding. Here we can see the cirrhotic lung. We can see the esophagus and esophageal varices portal hypertension picture. What are the common clinical manifestations for varices? It can present with bleeding, which presents as hematemesis, malignant, or hematochezia, and can present with hypovolemia and anemia, which can present as lightheadedness, weakness, tachycardia, and cold hands or feet. And also, it can present directly with cirrhosis, features of cirrhosis like complicated cirrhosis like ascites, encephalopathy, or jaundice. And it can also present with liver disease like spider angiomat and all. So how do you manage it? Active bleeding of a ruptured varice is a medical emergency due to hemodynamic instability. Management for active bleeding includes admission to a critical care unit, protection of airway from aspiration and massive bleeding with endotracheal intubation, insertion of NG tube for subsequent endoscopic procedure, begin volume resuscitation with crystalloids. So transfuse blood PRBCs to maintain hemoglobin with avoidance of mismatched transfusions. Use FFP to correct coagulopathy. Start vasoactive medications such as octreotide or valproatide. Start prophylactic antibiotics such as norfloxacin and ciprofloxacin. Administer lactulose for hepatic encephalopathy. And perform an EG endoscopy within 12 hours to confirm and treat bleeding varices with endoscopic variceal ligation or sclerotherapy. So here, this emergency mostly presents with hemodynamic instability. So we have to think in lines of that, and we have to really correct the coagulopathy, and we have to give transfusions, vasoactive medications, prophylactic antibiotics should be started, and we have to think of complications. We have to administer lactulose, and even EG endoscopy to confirm and treat bleeding varices also. If needed, we have to go with variceal ligation or sclerotherapy as well. And in resistant cases, we have to we can also go for TIPS, transjugular intrahepatic portocaval shunt, or a balloon tamponade for uncontrolled bleeding. And we can also give a prophylactic beta blocker such as nadolol or propranolol for common recurring bleeding, and monitor alcohol withdrawal symptoms and administer timely replacement if it is present. So Mr. J was resuscitated with fluids and RBCs, PRBCs. And when he was hemodynamically stable, he underwent an urgent upper GI endoscopy. The diagnostic test revealed an oozing bleeding varice located at second portion of the duodenum. An endoscopic variceal band ligation successfully controlled the bleeding. He was diagnosed with acute variceal bleed. He returned to his room and was discharged 5 days later after monitoring for recurrent bleeding. So coming to the next causes of UGI bleeding, Mallory with tears. These are laceration in the cardia caused by forceful emesis. These are commonly seen in alcoholic patients who retch after belching. These are usually single and longitudinal tears, and lesions have high rate of spontaneous cessation of bleeding, and intervention is only required in 10% of cases. So this will spontaneously resolve in almost up to 80% of the patients by the time endoscopy is performed. Rebleeding is also rare, and tears that are not actively bleeding can be managed with acid suppression and antiemetics alone. And endoscopic therapy is indicated for treatment of actively bleeding tears. A combination of thermal coagulation, hemoclips, or endoscopic band ligation with or without epinephrine injection can be used. And patients who have failed endoscopic therapy, then they have to undergo angiography with transarterial embolization. And surgery with oversewing of bleeding vessel is reserved for those who fail angiographic therapy. So this does not present as an emergency as in, but when there is continuously bleeding tears, then we have to go for endoscopic management. If endoscopic management fails, then we have to go for angiographic transarterial embolization. And if that also fails, then we have to go for surgery and with oversewing of bleeding vessel. So this is the management. So as we can see, single longitudinal tear in the cardia here. Next is Dewey-Laffoy lesions. This consists of an unusually dilated submucosal vessel with erosion of a small portion of the underlying mucosa. So lesions typically occur along the lesser curvature of the stomach within 6 cm of the GE junction. Because of the small size of mucosal defect, they can be difficult to identify also. This is the one. Given the large size of the underlying artery, the bleeding can be massive also. Usually they can be controlled endoscopically only. And if it fails, then angiography and embolization is an excellent option. If both those options are unsuccessful, which is rare also, then surgical intervention can be required, undertaken. An anterior gastrotomy should be performed with oversewing of the lesion. And if the lesion cannot be identified, sometimes even partial gastrectomy is required. Next causes are hemobilia and hemosuccus pancreaticus. Both are rare. Hemobilia is bleeding into biliary tract and hemosuccus pancreaticus is bleeding into the pancreatic ducts. These are rare causes of UGI bleeding and are usually treated related to recent instrumentation or trauma. The treatment of choice for both entities is angiographic embolization. Coming to general management of acute GI bleeding, triage patient up to the appropriate level of care and take medication history, especially with focus on cause of bleeding such as NSAIDs, aspirin, antiplatelet agents, or anticoagulants. Take a medical history including alcohol abuse, liver disease, previous bleed, peptic ulcer disease, renal disease, or heart failure. Examine for the bleeding symptoms. We have to see for hypovolemia features, shock or abdominal pain, and rectal examination is also mandatory. And lab tests including a complete blood count, serum chemistries, liver tests, coagulation studies, ECG with cardiac enzymes, and serial hemoglobin. And we have to perform an NG lavage to clean the stomach before endoscopy. Triage and consult with active bleeding. We can consult with gastroenterology. And if there's profuse bleeding, then we can consult with interventional radiologist. And resuscitation should be done through resuscitation, observe for fluid overload and bolus doses, and transfuse blood, including PRBCs, FFP, and platelets if needed, and prepare for diagnostic test. Upper endoscopy is a standard. So now we'll have an enhanced focus on common lower GI bleeding disorders. So colonic diverticular bleeding, number 1. So colonic diverticular disorder is the most common cause of lower GI bleeding. So what are the pathogenic changes responsible for bleeding colonic diverticulum in right colon? Especially penetrating vessel ruptures causing weakness of the wall, the wall draping over the dome of the diverticulum, recurrent segmented weakness of the artery, and the artery is at risk to rupture into the lumen. So clinical presentation, the typical presentation is painless hematochezia. The patient may have self-limiting bleeding that stops or massive persistent bleeding. So both ways it can present. Sometimes it may be self-limiting, sometimes it may be life-threatening, massive persistent bleeding. The patient may complain of bloating, cramping, and the urge to defecate due to bleeding. And severe bleeding causes hemodynamic instability as well, with the presentation of hypotension or tachycardia, and sometimes there will be altered sensorium also. We can see the colonic diverticulum. So diagnosis. The gold standard for identification of LGI bleeding site is colonoscopy itself. If the bleeding site is identified, banding or endoscopic hemoclips are used to control bleeding. And if the bleeding is not stopped or controlled, then segmental or subtotal colectomy needs to be performed. Next diagnosis, angiodysplasia. These are dilated tortuous submucosal vein found in the GIT that includes the colon, small intestine, stomach, and duodenum. This can cause bleeding at multiple sites. These are most common vascular anomalies found in GIT, appearing as small, flat, cherry red, radiating from central vessel with a fern-like pattern. So conditions associated with angiodysplasias also include older age, end-stage renal disease, von Willebrand disease, aortic stenosis. When started, recurrent bleeding can be a complication. So here we can see the cherry red thing coming in a fern pattern. Diagnosis and management, usually diagnosed during GI bleeding or during a routine colonoscopy. Treatment mostly endoscopic. Mechanical measures can be used like banding or endoscopic clips, organ plasma coagulation APC, electrocoagulation, or injection of sclerosant. Even ND-ER lasers can be tried. So this is an Auckland scoring. Again, just like the previous scoring, this scoring is used just for lower GI bleeding. So here, if the score is less than 8, again, the patient can be discharged from emergencies. The various components in Auckland score are age, gender, previous lower GI bleed admission, rectal examination findings, then heart rate, systolic BP, hemoglobin, and all. If endoscopic procedures are ineffective, the procedures that may be instituted can be angiography with infusion of vasopressin, or surgery for resection of these lesions, or hormonal therapy with estrogen to control bleeding in small bowel. So coming to general management of acute LGI bleeding. Patients with acute lower GI bleeding typically present with hematochezia. Bleeding can be self-limiting or life-threatening. General management for these critically ill patients include 1. Triaging the patient to appropriate level of care. Similar as we have seen in UGI bleeding. History taking for prior episodes of bleeding, past medical history, medications use, comorbidities, and bleeding symptoms. Then physical examination for the signs of hypovolemia or presence of any other symptoms. Then go for lab test, complete blood count, serum chemistries, liver test, and coagulation studies. And nasogastric lavage here to rule out any upper GI bleed, bright red colored or coffee colored. Blood will be found in lavage fluid if upper bleeding is there. Then triage and consultation with gastroenterology for acute bleeding and general surgery and interventional radiology for massive hematochezia. And supportive measures such as supplemental oxygen, fluid resuscitation, and intensity monitoring should be is required if there is risk of fluid overload in renal patients. And blood transfusions, including PRBCs and FFP if needed. And preparation for diagnostic tests like colonoscopy is the standard. So procedures for the evaluation and treatment of acute LGI bleeding. The diagnostic as well as therapeutic modalities are colonoscopy and angiography. So colonoscopy, what are the advantages? They have an excellent safety profile, high diagnostic and therapeutic yield, also can provide definitive diagnosis even if active bleeding has stopped. Coming to the disadvantages, large volume, rapid preparation of the colon is required before the procedure. Coming to angiography, what are the advantages? These are appropriate for patients with brisk bleeding whose condition cannot be hemodynamically stabilized for colonoscopy, or those who have ongoing or recurrent brisk bleeding after the colonoscopy. Coming to the disadvantages, relies on brisk active bleeding at the time of examination and higher rate of adverse events than with colonoscopy. So once a patient is hemodynamically unstable, when colonoscopy cannot be instituted, we can go for angiography. And other modalities which are diagnostic alone are multi-detector CT angiography as well as radionuclide scintigraphy. We'll go to the next slide. So this article, which has been published in New England Journal of Medicine, briefs the key clinical points to see in acute lower GI bleeding. Colonoscopy should be the initial procedure for most patients presenting with acute lower GI bleeding, and it should generally be performed within 24 hours after presentation, after hemodynamic resuscitation and colon cleansing. And if hematochezia is there in context of hemodynamic instability, this even can represent an upper GI bleeding. Therefore, upper endoscopy should also be considered even if patient presents with acute lower GI bleeding. And findings of active bleeding, or non-bleeding visible vessels or adherent clot should be treated when identified during colonoscopy. This is stage 1 and 2 according to Forrest classification. In patients with persistent bleeding or hemodynamic instability despite resuscitation efforts, again, radiographic evaluation and angiographic treatment should be considered, as we have just explained. And low-dose aspirin for primary prevention of cardiovascular events should be stopped in patients with lower GI bleeding and should generally not be restricted. If it is for primary prevention, we may not continue low-dose aspirin, but for secondary cardiovascular prophylaxis, this can be continued without interruption. And in patients who are receiving dual antiplatelet therapy, then aspirin can be continued without interruption, except if the patients are with high cardiovascular risk, then both should be continued, but the non-aspirin antiplatelet should be withheld for initial 7 days and then it can be restarted. Coming to the last topic, acute chemotherapy associated gastrointestinal mucositis. Mucositis is defined as inflammatory or ulcerative lesions of the oral or gastrointestinal tract. So alimentary tract mucositis refers to expression of mucosal injury across the continuum of oral and gastrointestinal mucosa from the mouth to anus. One of the major causes of mucositis is high-dose cancer therapy. So alimentary tract mucositis covers mucosal injury across the continuum of both oral as well as gastrointestinal mucosa from mouth to anus. But here we are dealing with gastrointestinal mucositis alone, that too chemotherapy-induced alone. So what is epidemiology? Incidence of oral and gastrointestinal mucositis in patients undergoing hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. This can be as high as 75% in patients undergoing hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, depending on the intensity of the conditioning regimen used and the use of methotrexate prophylactically to prevent graft versus host disease, especially when the chemotherapy used prior is methotrexate to prevent GVHD. Then the incidence of gastrointestinal mucositis can go up to 75%. So what is the incidence of mucositis associated with standard multi-cycle chemotherapy with or without radiotherapy for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and breast, lung, and colorectal cancers? So for all tumor sites, chemotherapy with 5-fluorouracil, capecitabine, or Tegafur leads to a high rate, that is up to 50% of alimentary tract mucositis. So these agents are quite notorious to cause mucositis. That is 5-fluorouracil, capecitabine, and Tegafur. And chemotherapy with methotrexate and other antimetabolites leads to 20 to 60% rate of alimentary tract mucositis, according to the drugs given dose per cycle. So again, methotrexate and other antimetabolites are also notorious for causing gastrointestinal mucositis. What are the risk factors for mucositis? The major patient-related risk factors for mucositis are: number 1, age. The children and elderly are at greater risk of mucositis. Coming to gender, women are at greater risk for severe grade 3 oral mucositis. Oral health and hygiene. Poor oral health and hygiene increase the risk of mucositis. And salivary secretory function. If the salivary secretory function is less and reduced salivary flow, this increases susceptibility to oral mucositis. Next are the genetic factors. Patients who express high levels of cytokines are already at the risk of higher risk of mucositis. So what are the major therapy-related risk factors for mucositis? Just now we have seen the patient-related risk factors. Now therapy-related risk factors. 1, chemotherapy agents, especially 5-fluorouracil, methotrexate, etoposide, capecitabine, and other antimetabolites. These are causing higher incidence of mucositis. Number 2, chemotherapy dosage. Obviously, high-dose chemotherapy regimens will cause greater risk and severity of mucositis. And the type of bone marrow transplantation, we all know allogenic poses more risk than autologous. Radiation site, radiation directly to head or neck or thorax, abdomen, or anorectal region can produce high rates of mucositis. Next is radiation fractionation. So altered fractionation schemes such as hyperfractionation or acceleration can obviously increase the risk of mucositis. Now, combined modality, obviously chemotherapy plus radiation therapy will pose more risk than chemo or radiation alone. Body mass index, lower body mass increase the risk of mucositis. What about renal function? If the renal function is decreased, then there is increased risk of mucositis. Smoking can also pose higher risk of mucositis. And what about previous cancer treatment? Patients who receive previous cancer treatment, they pose higher risk for mucositis. So let's see the pathophysiology. So we all know that there are 5 stages of mucositis. The first stage is initiation, which is followed by upregulation, which is followed by signal amplification. Finally, there is ulceration, and later there is healing also. So as the picture depicts, we can see this is the histopathology. So the timeline. So in the initial 2 days, what happens? The biomolecular consequences. There will be DNA damage initially. So in the next 2 to 3 days, there will be a formation of inflammasome. That is, there will be more inflammatory markers and everything. Reactive oxygen species will be increased, and the nuclear factor kappa B, everything will be increased. There is more inflammation. The stage is also known as upregulation, followed by initiation. So the next 2 to 5 days, what happens is there will be signal amplification. Here, the signals will be amplified, and there will be much more increase in the production of chemokines as well as cytokines. All these things will be increased, like TNF alpha, interleukin 6, interleukin 1 beta, everything is increased. And in the next 5 to 14 days, that is up to 14 days, there will be ulceration. So in ulceration phase, there is increased reactive oxygen species. There can be bacterial invasion. And in this stage, there can be opportunistic infection because the mucosa is, layer is hampered and due to ulceration. And so there will be increased bacterial invasion, and there are chances for opportunistic infections. And after 15 to 21 days, the next stage comes, that is healing. Here there will be collagen deposition and angiogenesis. So the 5 stages are initiation, followed by upregulation, followed by amplification, followed by ulceration, where there will be bacterial invasion and opportunistic infection, followed by healing, which happens after 15 days. So symptoms of GI mucositis, this can be dysphagia, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea, bloating, passing mucus from anus, ulcers in the anus and rectum, and rectal bleeding as well. What is the management of GI mucositis? Current and investigational approaches. So management consists of basic oral hygiene. So oral hygiene helps to reduce the bacterial load and consequently the infection risk. So include general hygiene standards, dental care, normal saline and baking soda mouthwashes, dietary and other behavioral measures. Coming to antioxidant agents. Role in reducing mucositis through suppression of reactive oxygen species. As we have seen, this has this had one of the main roles in the inflammation, or the increasing of endogenous production of antioxidative enzymes. So this will cause suppression of the reactive oxygen species. That is a role. And the examples are amifostine and glutamine. So amifostine, the mechanism of action of this agent is related to the recruitment of the reactive oxygen species scavengers and the protection of DNA, as well as induction of cellular hypoxia. This will protect. The next agent is glutamine. This is an amino acid involving in glutathione synthesis. It acts across exhibiting antioxidant properties, particularly by accelerating mucosal remodeling. Next agent is oral zinc supplements. So this also will act as antioxidant through several functions, including epithelial proliferation, extracellular matrix synthesis, and wound healing in damaged tissue. Next is vitamin E. This is alpha tocopherol, which can limit tissue damage caused by the release of reactive oxygen species. Next class are cytoprotective agents like sucralfate. This is a basic albumin salt and binds to proteins exposed by ulceration. So this will provide a protective coat against action of pepsin and gastric acid, and also will stimulate the production of local prostaglandins, angiogenesis, and fibroblast proliferation. So next, much debated topic is probiotics and antimicrobial agents, seen to improve crypts of small intestine, preserving architecture and preventing some alterations in the goblet cells, such as decrease of acidic mucin after chemotherapy. So probiotics have a role. Coming to natural remedies, natural agents like vitamin A, ascorbic acid, honey, aloe vera, curcumin, and other plant extracts have shown to be effective in mucositis. So coming to new frontiers in the pathobiology and treatment of cancer regimen-related mucosal injury. This article, which is published in 2017, this states that for prevention of CTRT-induced esophagitis, intravenous amifostine can be employed. And for the treatment of diarrhea associated with GI mucositis, octreotide can be used. And again, for prevention of diarrhea, probiotics such as lactobacillus can be used. So coming to management, according to guidelines developed by Mucositis Study Group of MASCC, so management of oral and gastrointestinal mucositis, ESMO clinical practice guidelines. These suggestions are consistent with good clinical practice. That is basic bowel care, maintenance of adequate hydration. Consideration should be given to the potential for transient lactose intolerance and the presence of bacterial pathogens. So there can be transient lactose intolerance due to the damage of healthy bacteria and presence of bacterial pathogens. So prevention of mucositis according to ESMO guidelines for prevention, especially in standard dose and high dose chemotherapy, ranitidine or omeprazole orally is recommended for prevention of epigastric pain following treatment with standard dose cyclophosphamide, methotrexate, 5-fluorouracil, or treatment with 5-fluorouracil with or without folic acid chemotherapy. This has grade 2A evidence for prevention. Ranitidine or omeprazole can be used, especially with the standard dose chemotherapies. And systemic glutamine is not recommended for prevention of GI mucositis. There's also grade 2C evidence. And so this was for standard dose and high dose chemotherapy. Now, while combined chemotherapy and radiotherapy for prevention, amifostine IV suggested to reduce esophagitis induced by concomitant chemotherapy and radiotherapy in patients with non-small cell lung cancer. So these were prevention. Now for treatment of GI mucositis, especially in standard dose and high dose chemotherapy, octreotide is recommended at a dose of at least 100 micrograms subcutaneously twice daily when loperamide fails to control diarrhea induced by standard dose or high dose chemotherapy associated with HSCT, hematopoietic stem cell transplant, grade 2A evidence. And these are guidelines modified from MASCC. So here we can see cancer of any kind, while stem cell transplant therapy as a treatment modality, octreotide can be used. The panel recommends that octreotide at a dose of more than 100 microgram subcutaneously twice daily may be used to treat diarrhea induced by standard or high dose chemotherapy associated with hematopoietic stem cell transplant if loperamide is ineffective. So initial loperamide trial can be done if it is ineffective, especially in case of diarrhea in hematostatic stem cell transplant post patients, octreotide can be employed. So in case of non-small cell lung carcinoma, it is proven that concomitant chemotherapy, while concomitant chemo and radiation therapy for prevention, amifostine is successful. The panel suggests that IV amifostine be used to prevent esophagitis induced by concomitant chemo and radiation therapy in patients with non-small cell lung carcinoma. And in pelvic malignancies, in the setting of chemotherapy and or radiation therapy for prevention, again, probiotics can be successfully used. The panel suggests that probiotics containing lactobacillus species may be used to prevent diarrhea in patients receiving chemotherapy and or radiation therapy for a pelvic malignancy. So coming to the take-home messages, gastrointestinal emergencies are to be dealt with utmost vigilance. They can have grave consequences. Even simple measures and strategies could be effective. Integration of various departments in a very good manner is a need of the hour, especially in chemotherapy-induced gastric mucositis. Prevention can be the key, and careful evaluation and good skills are needed for effective management.
Thank you, Neetu. So we can have a question, Arun. It was a wonderful presentation, Neetu.
Yes, thank you. There are some questions. Can we start with the questions, please?
Yes, Neetu, please go ahead.
Okay. So, Neetu, any role of PPI infusion in lower GI bleed in palliative care patient? Do you have any comments on this?
PPI infusions are mostly used in upper GI bleed, especially in peptic ulcer. We have not seen PPI using infusions being used in lower GI. I couldn't find any source for that.
Okay, I think more in gastroenterology where there is a peptic ulcer bleed, I think in those cases they might use PPI as infusion in case of severe peptic ulcer disease, but in palliative care we generally don't use it. That's okay. All right. So the next thing is about a suggestion, not a question. An approach to diagnosis and management of GI bleeds in palliative care setting, considering that we are working in that setting. I think you kind of spoke about it. So if we go through the whole of the seminar, I mean, this comment came in the middle of the seminar. So I think if we see the seminar in entirety, I think we'll get an idea about it. You spoke about a lot of agents in palliative care, which people might not use in everyday day-to-day practice, but these are something that can be used. And these are, I understand, updates in the literature. So it's also about updating our knowledge about the various agents that we can use in palliative care. But for choice of agent, definitely would depend on what is available in a particular setting. So we understand that. Then choice of PPI in chemo-induced gastritis. Any comments on that, please?
Chemo-induced gastritis, we do not really. Gastritis means which symptom exactly? If it is diarrhea, there is no such choice of PP in chemo-induced gastritis exactly. We can use pantop or omeprazole.
Yeah. So exactly. So PPI, choice of PPI exactly. So if you use proton pump inhibitors, I think they are good. And you have to be careful about kidney function, so that sometimes in oral metronomic chemotherapy, we have to be very careful for using PPIs, because that can hamper an excretion of certain medications used in oral metronomic chemotherapy. Okay, amifostine not generally available in our Indian setup. Any alternative available for amifostine? Any comments on that? I think it is a question for
ranitidine and omeprazole can be used for prevention. This is available in all setups.
Okay, thank you. And you have got congratulations from Stan. Excellent update, Neetu. Thank you for the updates. Thank you very much. No further comments, ma'am. You can please take over.
So thank you, Neetu. Thank you for a very nice update. The purpose of this update is not that all the agents we will be using in palliative care settings. I have witnessed one of my residents' mother when that terminal bleed has happened, GI bleed has happened, because we all were knowing the concept of palliative medicine, and even the whole family members were very well counseled and updated. So they have just remained with her, and we have not used all these agents, but all these agents we should be knowing. The question which somebody has asked, that how we handle the chemotherapy-induced gastritis. I think chemotherapy-induced gastritis definitely should be treated, and we should have a full knowledge of all these agents and all various modalities where we can definitely reduce the bleeding. But when a stage of terminal bleeding will come, definitely we are going to be there with patient, and we will not be managing with all these agents. But as a palliative care physician, all the residents and all the young palliative care physicians, they should have full knowledge of all these agents. So Neetu, it was a very comprehensive. We are asking two to three topics for each session, and I think all are doing very, like they must be doing, they must be struggling how to handle with the 40 minutes and 45 minutes, but they are doing well. And you have covered all the important aspects. So thank you very much. We will see you next week again with a bright, young, immediately finished palliative care physician from Tata Memorial Hospital, and with a new topic and new updates. Thank you very much. And thank you, Arun. Thank you, Nisha. And thank you, Archana, for keeping us, all of us, on track. And thank you, Neetu. Thank you very much.